Hi guys, Nick Thomas here at the Academy of Historical Fencing. So about small swords, Matt Easton at Scott Laboratory recently did a video about a week ago on small swords and foils, practice versions of them, and epées as well, and looking at the original sort of weights, lengths and comparisons of the two or three, and asking the question, why don't we use foils for small sword? And it's actually a really good question that I don't think anybody's quite got an answer for yet. There are some theories, and some good theories, but yeah, there's still some questions there to be answered definitely. But Matt put together his collection and took those dimensions down. I think that's some really good information, and I just wanted to basically add on to that some extra examples, because I have a good selection myself of original small swords. I have one original foil and some training swords as well. So I'm going to kind of look at what I've got here and look how they basically measure up in the grand scheme of things. I do talk about small swords reasonably often, I would say. They are certainly an important subject to what we do, because although, you know, a lot of stuff I do is military swordsmanship, although the rapier isn't, but the foil was always important to military swordsmanship. It was always practiced, almost always anyway. So what do we have here? Let's start off with probably what is the earliest example here, and this is the Kalishimad blade that Matt also talked about. We've got this really broad section on the fourth at the start of the blade, which tapers quickly, but it's hologrammed and triangular, so yeah, it's quite light for what it is. Incidentally, Matt did his out in the garden in the nice sunshine. I'm not. You're in the dining room with me here because I live in Wales. It's raining. Of course it's raining. Anyway, looking at the Kalishimad, so this one is 450 grams, absolutely dead on, 450 grams. So, you know, a little bit lighter than some of the examples that Matt was showing, although he did have one that was just a little bit lighter again. Notice there's no knuckle bow on this one. Most small swords have knuckle bows, but there is a sizable minority, sort of a fashion trend within small swords, if you like, that didn't. And ultimately, there's no real need to have a knuckle bow on a small sword. I would say it's really left there for tradition and fashion. I suppose you could say it could provide a little bit of protection against someone who is using cuts with a different kind of sword against you. But the knuckle bows are so modest, you know, hard to say. But anyway, so that is a Kalishimad small sword without a knuckle bow. It is intact, aside from the grip. There would have been some kind of wrap, probably wire wrap or something like that, on top of this woodwork. But that's going to add, you know, a matter of a few grams. So 450, well, probably would have been something like 452, something like that, grams. So very, very light. And this one is crown stamped. It's probably from about 1730, 1740, and it's English, so an English officer's small sword. So yeah, 450 grams. Small swords are light, inevitably they're light. I mean, they should be with the name small sword. In terms of blade measure, I like to measure to the actual cross of the sword rather than to the shell or the dish of a guard, just because the ricasso lengths can vary a bit. I mean, it doesn't really matter as long as, you know, you tell your audience where you're measuring to. So yeah, but I tend to measure to the cross, and that's a carryover from rapiers, especially because the ricassos vary so much on them that it's quite useful to measure up to the cross or the quillen. So this one is 85 centimeters, which is 33.5 inch, or if you were measuring to the shell, it would be 82 or 32.25. So that's kind of, I would say that's really typical length and weight of a sort of Kalishimad blade. And the only thing that would make this any more typical of this kind of small sword is that more often they would have a knuckle bow than not. But as I said, it's not missing from this. This design did not ever have one. So there's a Kalishimad small sword, 450 grams. And I said 85 centimeter blade. That was right. 85, yes, 33.5 inch. So that's actually quite a length. Don't see, you know, a lot of small swords come in 30, 31, 32, so that's quite long. But again, it depends how you're measuring them, whether you're measuring to the shell or to the cross. Measured to the actual shell, you could see this was a, what did I say, 32¼ inch. So yeah, very, very typical. Moving on from that, okay, this one, it is a Kalisha realistically because it has this widening section, but it's quite a subtle Kalisha. I mean, this one is, more what you'd expect, a very large, broad section at the fort. This has it, but it's quite modest, so a very subtle Kalisha, if you like, sort of in between. And this one, it's completely traditional in small sword form. This is the kind of the most typical example you're going to see of the small sword hilt format. The shells are always on small swords incredibly small, even smaller than, say, a foil guard in sport fencing today. Right, so how does it weigh up? Well, if I can get the scales to work. Okay. 449 grams. It's 1 gram difference. That's quite impressive in terms of variation. And notice Matt found a lot of his stuff he was comparing was nigh on identical. We're starting to see that trend already. So this one to the shell is 81 centimeters, just under 32 inch, or 84 to the cross, which would be 33 inch. So it's near enough the same size and the same weight. This sort of subtle Kalisha blade to the knuckle bolus substantial Kalisha. And in terms of what they balance, so you're talking the Kalisha, a very broad one, is 9 centimeters from the shell or 12 centimeters from the cross. That's actually balancing very far forward, and that doesn't surprise me because this really feels like it has a lot of blade presence for the type of sword it is. Don't think of it as heavy. Again, like Matt said, you might think it's heavy because it's so broad here, but it's all hollow ground out, triangular and hollow ground very deeply on all 3 sides. So it's a lot lighter than it looks, but yeah, it has some real strength to it. You get the feeling that you could really control a lot of blades very well with this. It's quite forward heavy, if you like, for the type of sword that it is. And the other one, as I call it, the subtle Kalisha. Some people might argue that it's not Kalisha, this one. I think it is, just because it does have that sort of taper at the fort. It's just a little bit more subtle. And this one is 6 centimeters from the shell and 8 from the cross or the quillen. So a little bit further back. Anyway, those are very, very similar to one another, and this one is it's going to be a similar time period. It's going to be 1740 up to about 1760. The Kalisha are all approximately in that time frame. Okay, so what else do we have here? The next small sword I'm going to show you a little bit more unusual because it is actually a double-edged blade. So it's more typical of what you might think of not what you might think of. What are typical more of rapiers than small swords. And not all small swords have triangular section blades, but it is one of those sort of characteristic features that people think of with small swords. The small sword typically is very light, but quite stiff for its and strong for its low weight, and really a thrusting sword only, which makes this a little bit interesting because this one is more like a small rapier blade, in that it's double-edged, and it is actually sharpened on both edges as well. I would say from about the last third of its blade length, it's sharp, quite sharp, very sharp really on both sides. It is, as a result, a little bit more flexible on its entire length than the triangular section blades. It's also heavier and a little bit more unwieldy. The triangular hologram blades, they are really light, and this one isn't. This one actually feels like a completely different kind of sword, which makes it quite interesting. And this one is 511 grams, so it's a sizable amount more than those last two sort of Kalisha swords, small swords that I showed you. It doesn't sound like a massive amount, but 60 grams in a sword, it is substantial when that 60 grams is all in the blade. If the 60 grams was spread across the sword, you would not notice it to anything like the same degree. you would feel it, but not massively so. But when the hilt on this one is approximately the same sort of size and weight of this other example that I showed you, all that extra weight, the extra 60 grams, are all in the blade. And as a result, it feels like a completely different kind of sword. And incidentally, it all seems to have been made this way. It doesn't seem to have been what we call a composite in collecting terms, where at a later date, an earlier or newer blade has been fitted to a different period hilt. It doesn't always have to be the same, or it doesn't have to be a different period necessarily, but it wasn't originally made that way. So different parts put together. A fruit salad, if you like, as we'd call it in vehicle terms. Yeah, and this one balances at 12 centimeters to the shell and 14 and a half to the quillen. So, you know, that's a long way. That is, it does feel, this one feels like a small rapier, which is really, I find really interesting. And it does actually have some cutting ability, to the level that this actually feels more like a light spadroon, more than the other small swords do. So yeah, that's an interesting example. Now, what else do we have? This example, I would say the likelihood with this one is that it's more what you call a court sword, more than a small sword, in that it's for wear at court. It's for purely a dress item more than an item for fighting. That said, it still has a wicked point on it. It is made in a typical triangular hologram fashion. It is every bit as deadly as those other two small swords that or three I've actually showed you, but the other two Kali Shimard small swords. This isn't Kali Shimard, as you can see, it's a standard triangular section blade. And this one is the lightest sword I have ever handled. And you'll get what I mean when I weigh it now, because it is quite incredible. Okay, it weighs 279 grams, 279, meaning that it is almost half the weight of the last small sword that I showed you, the double-edged one. So truly incredible. And as I said, I don't think this is necessarily in the same category as those, because I think this one is more a specifically kind of dress sword for the court, if you like, more than the small swords, which are you know, civilian self-defense, dueling, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a really interesting example, but I don't think it doesn't represent the other small swords in quite the same way. Incidentally, I missed the blade length of the double-edged small sword out. So what was it? 80.5 centimeters to the shell, 83 to the cross. That's yeah, 31 3/4 inch or 32 3/4 inch. So again, typical sort of dimensions. You're not seeing a lot of variety here, which is you know, nice to see. Anyway, onto the foil. So Matt had a few foils to show you, some British military examples and a French example, and I've only got the one foil. They're not quite my thing, although I started to get an interest the more I dig into the small sword. I've sort of done small sword on and off over the years, and it's something I would like to encourage more people into, because it is fun, but it's hard to really motivate people to do it, because, you know, that doesn't look much like a big sword that's going to hack someone's head off that most people want to practice with. I don't understand why that might be, but you get the idea. Right. Doesn't mean I dislike small swords, by the way. I like small swords. They're interesting. This foil. Okay, so it's 265 grams. And that makes it even lighter by a margin, small margin, than the lightest sword I've ever seen. And I did say sword, because I wouldn't count this as a practice sword. You can't quite always compare them. So an actual sharp, usable sword, yeah, this is a margin lighter again. And that's really interesting, because Matt showed you the three examples he had there, and they were all, I think the British ones were 480 grams, he said, and I think the French one was down to about 400. But yeah, this one is far lighter again. Now, exactly where this is from and how to date it, it's not exactly that easy, because foils of this type, they didn't change an awful lot, and the only marking on the blade is almost impossible to read now, unfortunately, so I can't quite tell. But the form of, the figure of 8 guard is typical all the way through the 18th and the 19th century and going just about into the early 20th. And I would say this one looks exactly like a lot of the dated examples I've seen to Germany around about the late 19th century. So I'd say it's quite possibly that's what it is. And it has buff leather guard inside. There's some felt on top and some decorative piece on the top as well. But and you can see it's got the typical nail head, if you like. So this is a fencing foil, as they still use in Olympic fencing today. I mean, it has changed a little bit, not drastically actually. The guard has got a little bit larger. They sometimes use the pistol grips and things like that. And the length, okay. Right. 85 centimeters blade length on this, so that's 33.5 inch, which means that it matches up pretty much with all of the originals that I've shown you. They're all around about 33 inch, so it's right on there, bang on to match up with the originals. Yeah, it matches very, very closely to them. Now, in terms of standardization, I know Matt's ones were about an inch or so longer. So was there that much variation, or is this more a junior blade? It's entirely possible. I mean, today you have different size blades in sport fencing, so it could be. But it is, as I said, an exact match-up to the original examples of small swords I've got here. That said, if this is from the late 19th century, obviously the small swords I've shown you weren't. They are from the early up to late 18th century. So that's fencing foil. I'd like to see a little more data on the original examples of this, because obviously that's a huge disparity between this one and the ones that Matt was showing you. From, you know, sort of mid 200 grams up to 400 to 480. That's a huge variety. Now, what else do I have here? Well, the last original sword I'd like to show you is not a small sword. It's actually a spadroon, and I like to bring up spadroons. They need a bit of love. And the reason I show you this is just because I want to show you how close spadroons can potentially be to small swords. And this one, by the way, is a George III marked, late 18th century, probably 1788 pattern, so the first ever British infantry officer's pattern spadroon. And right, how much does it weigh? If I can get it to sit neatly, there we go. 552 grams. So only 40 grams heavier than the heaviest small sword that I've got here, and only 100 grams heavier than the two typical examples that I've got. So you can see that's just how close it is. I mean, this is a light spadroon, definitely. They vary quite a bit. The blade length is 83 centimeters. So this spadroon is the exact length and only 100 grams 100 grams heavier than the typical small swords that I showed. And the balance is at 12 centimeters. So it's kind of like really in typical specification for small swords. Of course, it's really not entirely fair to compare it. Not because it's double-edged, because I showed you a double-edged small sword, but just because it has no shells. And the shells do add weight, and they add to the handling characteristics in terms of how it feels in the hand. So it's not entirely fair to compare it, but it is really interesting to note that if you take my double-edged small sword and you take this spadroon, the difference between them is really, really modest. So sometimes at the extreme end of the scale, what is the difference between a small sword and a spadroon? Well, they can get really, really close. But as I said, that's from one extreme up to the lower extreme of the next sword up in weight. Anyway, that's just an interesting comparison. What else do I have to show you? Well, this has been my standard small sword trainer for a while now. Sadly, they're out of production. This is a Red Dragon small sword, so it's Nightshot made. and they used essentially a sports saber blade on it, which is an interesting choice. I'd never thought to use a saber blade for small sword training. You just wouldn't assume it, because the saber is, after all, even the sports saber, designed for some cutting, and the small sword is not. So the saber blade is a triangular section, but in quite a different way to the épée, and comes to basically a square section tip in much the same way as a foil. So it's kind of like a hybrid between an épée and a foil, sort of. And yeah, it's actually been quite good. But I'd like to just get some specs on that. 500 grams exactly. And length, the blade length is 88.5 to the shell and 91 to the quillen. So this one's coming out a bit heavier than my originals, aside from the double-edged one, and also a bit longer. And I believe that was probably the length of Matt's foil, actually. What did he say? He said 34 inches. Actually, it's a almost 36-inch blade going to the cross, or 35 to the shell. So I would say that is excessively long for representing the kind of small swords of the 18th century. It's longer than I thought it was, actually. So that's an interesting one. It could do with a couple of inches coming off, which would also bring the weight down exactly to typical specification. And balance, it's balancing roughly the same as the other ones were. So that's the Red Dragon small sword, which has been my standard for a while. Before that, I used a Sport 7 small sword, which I still have somewhere, but I broke the blade and I haven't got around to replacing it yet. And before that, I used Hamway when they were still making those, and also an All-Star French grip foil on an épée blade. So I've had a few different things over the years. Never been wholly happy with any of them, but they've all been okay. And lastly, this is something I picked up recently. This is either an original hilt or a recasting of an original hilt. I'm not entirely sure which. If I had to put my money on it, I'd probably say it's a recast. So actually somebody's taken a mould of an original small sword hilt and recast it, which means that at least it is the exact right sort of size and specification, and it's been mounted on an épée blade, which actually is still sharp, which I'll probably be inclined to blunt and tip at some stage soon and start using this one as well. But that's just interesting to see how an actual standard small sword hilt mounted on an épée blade compares to an actual full small sword. So it's 514 grams. So as heavy as my double-edged small sword, and a good bit heavier than my triangular bladed, the Clichamard types. Blade length 87 to the shell and 90 to the guard. So this is basically the same as the Red Dragon. So essentially that is the standard sort of adult épée blade today. So it's a bit long, and yet the balance is still about right. I would say the blade on this is, yeah, it's a little bit longer, a little bit narrower than typical original examples of small swords would be. So there you go, there's some specification. Small swords then, in my experience, the ones I've got, looking at Matt's stuff, looking at other people's, and looking at like Leeds Armories and stuff like that, most small swords fall into the category of around 400 to 500 grams. There's not a lot outside that range. There are some extremes, like the double-edged one, which is slightly over. There was the court sword, which is well under. But the vast majority fall into the 400 to 500 gram mark. And I'd be really interested to see how that compares to a range of foils, because Matt's foils fell into the same range, the 400 to 500 range. My one came in substantially lighter. Now, in terms of should we use foils or épées, I don't have an answer for that at this stage. The current sport fencing foils aren't really ideal for it, because if you go for the shorter lengths, they're incredibly light, and they can be quite whippy. I mean, this is really quite stiff compared to a modern foil. So would I use foils? Yes, I would, but I would like a foil designed for what we do and not sport fencing. There's nothing to criticise of the sport fencing foil. It's just not quite what we want to use when we're doing basically 18th and 19th century foil. Why did they use foils instead of épées, which is one of the big questions Matt's got in his video, and we've been talking about on some groups online. Again, I'm not entirely sure. I've got some theories. Tradition could be a part. Matt mentioned cost, that could be a significant point. I think there's a good chance flexibility is going to be to play there, because a foil blade flexes really nicely, and an épée blade, because of its nature, is a lot stiffer. I mean, this is actually a nice modern épée blade. They're a lot stiffer and they're more prone to snapping. And I suspect that even though they also did still have, by the 19th century, they had practiced épée blades, I suspect the foil was just preferred for the fact that it's a little bit safer. I think. Just a theory. I'm not sure on that. So, yeah, small swords. They tend to weigh 400 to 500 grams. The blade lengths are, to the cross, about 32 inch, which is about 81, 82 centimeters, about typical. The balances, they vary, depend on the blade construction, but they usually balance just in front of the guard by a couple of fingers max, and there's a good overall view. The grip lengths Matt's mentioned as well in terms of how they compare. He mentioned using larger grip lengths for big gloves. Well, you certainly could use a big glove on this. It's a little bit smaller than the ones he was showing, but it is longer than the originals with more space. So you certainly could, you think how much room I've got there, you certainly could use a big glove with that. And I think that's bang on. Anyway, so that's kind of an overview to a selection of small swords, originals, a foil, looking at some training swords, and a spadroon for good measure, because there should always be a spadroon somewhere. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do so.